Whether you see the Draka novels as a layered dystopia reflecting multiple facets of American history and society, an adolescent fantasy of right-wing boys, or just plot-armored Mary Sue villains in implausible alternate history, S.M. Stirling's Draka books still stir up strong reactions almost 40 years on. The series begins with Marching Through Georgia, a World War II story following a Draka paratrooper unit led by Aaron von Schreckenberg, a dashing and heroic young aristocratic officer who outwits his foes, both the Nazis and his own nation's secret police, all the while coming across as almost likable for a slaver. I've already rambled at length about World War II being in many ways the institutional and cultural foundation for modern America, and the Eurasian War has the Draka reflecting America's emergence from a regional power to a world-straddling superpower. Through it, we get our first iteration of the Draka mythos, damn near invincible supermen and women who will not stop until they rule the world. And then there's The Big Lie by Jane Lindskold in the short story collection Drakas, offering a decidedly more cynical perspective on those events depicted in Marching Through Georgia. It treats the book as Aaron von Schreckenberg's personal myth-making and then proceeds to tell us, according to its narrator, what really happened. This time it's told by one Covington Comer, now a retired arch-strategos, but at the time a sniper attached to 1st Airborne Century A under von Schreckenberg. He is not fond of Eric by any stretch, and the story skewers both the character and the Draka mythos in several deft moves with a meta-narrative of the books we know, or rather, something not too unlike them, as propaganda. The novels that have done the most for creatively presenting the image and philosophy of the Draka to the world at large have also served as propaganda for one of the most prominent Draka families, the von Schreckenbergs. Chew on that while I tell you the truth behind the campaign that pulled dear Eric out of the reach of the politicals and injected him firmly into the Draka ass. Comer is a far cry from the Draka Superman image. I mean, sure, he can fight, run, shoot, he's a competent soldier, but he's not an ideologue, nor is he one for unnecessary heroics. The other thing I learned to do in the Army was to bunk and run, not letting my commanders know what I was about, of course. In the process of perfecting this art, I learned how to claim credit for other soldiers' achievements. This was easier to do than you might imagine, since most of the real heroes were reduced to artful red smears on the landscape. So you have some idea who your source is. Now, one of the key elements of young Vishrak in the novels is that he's, for a Draka, fairly liberal. He's the reasonable one, weighed down by this almost Jeffersonian guilt about the evils of slavery while unable to escape the system built on it. He's a Draka that the free world can negotiate with. Or perhaps it's all just a carefully constructed image, a little strategic misdirect. Don't you ever forget as you read this, smug in your late historical superiority with all the earth ground beneath the heel of the domination and liking it too, that assassination was a very real risk during the years following the war against the Fritz as we set out to pacify the lands that had been Hitler's and were now our own. So don't forget that Eric had every reason to want the Allies to view him as a lesser evil than most other Draka politicians. But I stray from the point. The story peels away at least a few layers of the Draka plot armor. Not only is Comer fond of avoiding danger by holing up and waiting things out, he also gets roped into helping out the locals when Abdul gets the drop on him. The chief partisan had told me to call him Abdul. His expression had been so sour I knew he was well aware that this was our derogatory slang for all ragheads. In addition to Abdul and Anya, there were a half-dozen other partisans, all scrawny but all as silent in the woods as ghosts. Comer shoots a few collaborators for them and delivers a message. He doesn't know what the message is, it's written in Arabic, but he passes it on. I don't want to do a whole play-by-play here, the story is worth reading on its own, but you know the broad strokes of the ending if you've ever read Marching Through Georgia. It's the details where things get interesting and where this story really amplifies the overall themes of the Draka stories while simultaneously breaking down some of the mythos. As mythos. I just didn't believe that somehow we Draka were better than the rest of humanity. Meaner, tougher, better trained, I had no problem with believing that. Thor's hammer, hadn't I been hustled off to a boarding boot camp at an age when most children were still toddling about under their parents' loving care? If such brutality didn't produce a better trained product, then what was the use? Why do the Draka win more often than not? Because they try harder. Stirling covers this too, most directly with the dinner party speech by the elderly Karl von Schreckenberg flat out calling horseshit on the Draka Manifest Destiny story in Under the Yoke. But for the most part, the Draka stories imply an inexorable expansion with relatively minor inconveniences on the way, which you can dismiss as just Mary suing the villains, but I think that misses the point. Remember that the Draka are a sort of mirror universe America. We too had the manifest destiny of divinely endorsed dominion over the continent, a story that the massive westward expansion from the Revolution through the 19th century fulfills. We just don't talk about that little fumble in Quebec in 1775, and we like to think of the Civil War as a crusade to end slavery rather than a near-fatal breakup and refutation of the great American story of progress. Liberty, sea to shining sea and all that. A people's history is one part things that happened and two parts arranging those events to fit their own self-image. Those of us raised on the American story of World War II have a narrative of a nation reluctantly but heroically taking up arms to liberate Europe from tyranny because we're a righteous, freedom-loving people and it was the right thing to do. Yay, we saved the world. Ask a Russian and you'll get a rather different story. Neither one is quite true, but they're based on some true things, and looking back, they imply a sense of inevitability to the United States and the Soviet Union inheriting dominion over the world after the war. Starting the Draka story with marching through Georgia, a World War II story, shows us an askew take on that same narrative. Eric, as the personification of the Draka, overcomes the enemy and his own short-sighted security service through forethought, guile, and nerves of steel. The stage is set for the Draka to take on the world, and he will lead them to ultimate victory. It's grand myth-making. The Big Lie shifts perspective and makes his win about luck as much as anything. Just like the third book in the series, The Stone Dogs, and the actual Second World War, victory is as much about the losers making mistakes as the victors doing things right. It could have gone many different ways. But the end result, whether we're speaking of America in our own history or the Draka, is a regional power becoming a global superpower by virtue of being one of the last left standing when the old world order was shattered by war. But with a national story that makes it seem almost inevitable in retrospect. Bringing me to another story in the collection that really captures something of the Draka before that superpower status. Hewn in Pieces for the Lord by John J. Miller is set in the 1880s, with the Draka as an aggressive young empire just starting to push its way out of Africa. And it begins with an entire legion of janissaries under Draka officers being annihilated by native forces in Sudan. Like the British before them, the Draka are good, but they are not invincible. The story is told from the perspective of Charles Gordon, a British general who in our own history died trying to defend Khartoum from the Mahdi's army. In this story, his life takes a few different turns, as the British colonization of Africa did generations before. Gordon, having health issues in 1880 after a long campaign in Sudan that, among other things, aimed to crush the slave trade, resigned that post but remained in the army. In this story, his military service is over. The Draka make British involvement in the region much less significant. But he's not a man that can just be idle. He's in Alexandria in pursuit of his new mission, something greater to dedicate himself to as he once did with his military service. A scheme to dam the Nile River and make it the longest navigable waterway in the world. Since the Draka now own the Nile like they own the rest of Africa, Gordon had to plead his case before them. And so he finds himself in the company of Alexander von Schreckenberg, one of the influential Draka he has to win over. He's agreeable to the plan, but Sudan is a problem. There's this man who calls himself the Mahdi. Have you heard of him? Because of his prior service with the British, Gordon knows the area well and he has contacts. Perhaps even contacts who know the Mahdi personally and can broker an arrangement. It wouldn't hurt if we knew more about him, perhaps even somehow brought him to our side. After all, we're reasonable men. Men from many nations have become Draka. Von Schreckenberg shrugged. And the sooner there is peace on the Nile, the sooner you can begin to build your dam. Gordon and von Schreckenberg locked eyes for a long moment. And this is the consensus of your people? Gordon asked. It is. Von Schreckenberg paused. Generally, there are those who favor a more direct solution to the problem of the Mahdi. Direct? Gordon asked. Direct, unmistakable, brutal. Kill them all and let the Valkyries sort them out. Myself, I find such an approach wasteful of resources, but the Security Directorate... Von Schreckenberg shook his head. They're a newly organized arm of the domination, and ambitious. This is the firmament on which the entire story rests, and this story is a slice of the Draka transforming from an essentially 18th century colonial throwback into a modern authoritarian state. So Gordon sets off to Khartoum by airship. As depicted in this story and historically, he is a deeply religious fellow and known to personify his own unchristian thoughts as something outside, most notably a demon he called Agag after a biblical verse. It's somewhere in Samuel. I'm sure it comes as a surprise to no one that I can't quote scripture from memory. Agag figures into this story as the source of self-serving pride, in a sense cleaving pieces off to better suit his idea of what should be. The title works on multiple levels, one of them being the way that Gordon can reconcile his own contradictions. On the trip to Khartoum, he composes a letter to his sister, a passage of which reads, "I am amazed at the scientific progress the Draka have made in such a short time. They are an amazing people, though personally I find them repellent. The only likable Draka I have met so far is Alexander von Schreckenberg, and he is morally bankrupt. They are sinners all, though it is my job neither to save them from hell or preach to them of heaven. They will likely all burn forever. Some, like von Schreckenberg, because of mere folly, others because of a deeper, more pervading evil. But enough of that. I have, dearest Augusta, good news. Von Schreckenberg has agreed to the plan, and through him I have gotten the backing of the Alexandria Institute as well. The Nile Dam will become a reality. That he will be laboring on a project that will benefit these morally bankrupt people isn't really the issue for him. The dam itself is a positive good, regardless of who materially benefits from it. He arrives to find that the Security Directorate has taken command of the small garrison in Khartoum, and he's ordered to report to Monarch William Quantrill. Quantrill was a real guy. Among other things, he led a group of irregular troops, a band of brigands essentially, for the Confederacy during the American Civil War. In this story, like so many Confederates, he throws in with the Draka after the war. I generally don't care for the alternate history thing of using real people in a setting that's already several generations past, whatever point of departure was the basis for that setting. But this story does it well, so it doesn't much bother me here. At one point in particular, I really like it. Gordon knows that he'll end up sidelined if he reports as ordered, so instead he grabs a carriage and rushes off to meet one of his old contacts, who puts him in touch with someone who can get him a face-to-face meeting with the Mahdi. The man inclined his head to Desmond and returned a speculative eye to Gordon. "You're not unknown in the Sudan. My name is Arthur Rimbaud." Yes, that Rimbaud. He did spend some time running guns in Africa. I kind of wonder if the initial seed of this whole story was about finding a way to have Rimbaud meet some Draka. So they make their way to the Mahdi's camp. They find him quite impressive. And they talk. Probably wisely, the story doesn't go into much detail of the Mahdi's exploits prior to leading his revolt. Late 19th century North African events would play out quite differently, with the Draka trying to establish formal control. But through it all, he proves to be a reasonable man and is likely aware of just how much force can be brought to bear given enough time, and in exchange for a number of assurances, agrees to a treaty with the Draka. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy this. Never trust a treaty with Americans or Draka. I suspect the Mahdi would have learned that long ago. Though admittedly I don't know a whole lot about late 19th century Sudan nor Muhammad Ahmad bin Abdullah bin Fahal's understanding of wider geopolitics. Whatever the case, they have an agreement, and Gordon, feeling that something is off, gives Rimbaud the treaty and sends him to von Schreckenberg, who has a legion waiting to come in. Things go all kinds of wrong. Again, I won't go into all the details. The whole sequence of events is satisfying to read, but it's a Draka story, so it's not really spoiling things to say that the Mahdi is less successful at Khartoum. And rather than dying trying to hold the city, Gordon now has a new life's work ahead of him. Work that doesn't require killing, at least not with his own hands. Gordon and von Schreckenberg both got what they wanted in the end. And it ends with another letter from Gordon to his sister, and an observation that, like Comer's point in The Big Lie about the Draka not being better people, just better trained, Gordon says that there are some questions about the curious death of a Draka Merarch that must be answered, but von Schreckenberg assures me that matters will work out just fine. The affair ended satisfactorily for the Draka, and that really is all they care about. The Mahdi's revolt is over, and the Sudan is pacified. Not in the way I would have wished, but as you know, my dear, that is often the case in life. The Draka are both determined and pragmatic. They win partly because they can pivot with changing circumstances, but even more than that, they just try harder. They commit fully. They want it more. That alone isn't enough, of course. There have been plenty of cases where machine guns trump determination, but it's something to consider with conflicts in our own world today. If you're not willing to fight as hard or as long as the other guy, it's probably not a fight you want to get sucked into. But back to this collection specifically. Not only does it have several good stories besides these two, but the fact that it exists speaks to Stirling having touched on something significant with his Draka novels. Many books make the reader think, but there's something about a book that spurs other writers to write in its world, to expand on it with different perspectives. And I don't mean just fan fiction, which is fine, but I'm talking mostly about serious, often professional writers writing original stories that explore facets of the narrative in a way different from but complementary to the original author. That's complementary with an E, not necessarily an I. Usually they're stories that not only entertain, but speak to something foundational to the people that read them. Clearly the Draka haven't had the same breadth of cultural impact as Star Wars or Middle-earth, but there's a similar resonance there. They're stories that cut to the heart of something and leave a lasting impression. Anyway, parting note. In another amusing little detail, Gordon's letter ends with a gripe about having to attend social gatherings in the von Schreckenberg home. As you know, I find that sort of thing tiresome, but just this morning, he and his wife Edith were telling me about this new house guest due to arrive later today. Alexander swears that he's a brilliant conversationalist and great wit, and that I'll just adore him. He's a writer like that Frenchy Rimbaud. I guess, all in all, Rimbaud wasn't a bad fellow, but he's hardly someone you'd care to invite to your home. Ha, like myself, some would say. Perhaps, like our Lord Christ, I will learn to practice more tolerance. Anyway, he's an Irish chap, name of Oscar Wilde. Never heard of him? I'd like to read that story. With his visit to the United States as a guide, I imagine he'd get himself killed in a duel, spending much time amongst Draka. But the remark that brought the challenge would no doubt be an immortal witticism. Though, admittedly, I don't know a whole lot about late 19th century Sudan, nor Muhammad Ahmad bin Abdullah bin Falal's, damn it, almost.